in the shadows of a grim debt auction, where desperate families sold their own daughters to settle their debts. A ruthless duke made a decision that stunned the entire hall. Duke Valerian Crowe, the coldest, most feared man in England, walked past every beautiful, elegant young woman begging for his attention and stopped directly in front of the plainest, most pitiful girl in the room. She stood there in a torn crimson gown, a heavy slave collar locked around her neck, wrists bound, and her face completely hidden behind a black lace veil. With a single commanding gesture, he bought her, specifically to humiliate and destroy her. He wanted a broken, silent wife he could ignore and punish for the rest of her days. But the moment he dragged her away and ripped off that veil in private, he froze. What he uncovered was not the worthless plain girl he had chosen. What he saw would shatter all his cruel plans and awaken something dangerous inside him. Stay with me, because this is only the beginning of a story filled with shocking betrayal, dark secrets, and a love born from the deepest humiliation. A story where a powerless young woman rises from the ashes of cruelty and slowly melts the frozen heart of the most ruthless duke in England. If you love tales of resilience, revenge, and forbidden romance, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell right now, so you don't miss what happens next. The air in the old assembly hall hung thick with candle smoke and desperation. Rows of women stood like forgotten merchandise under the flickering light, their families hovering nearby with hardened faces. Tonight was not about marriage. It was about survival, about selling what little dignity remained to settle debts that had grown too heavy to carry. Elowen Voss stood at the far end of the line, the lowest and most pitiful offering of all. Her once elegant crimson gown hung in tatters, the shoulder torn and the hem stained with mud from the journey. A heavy leather collar circled her slender throat, connected to a leash that dangled mockingly from the auction master's grip. But worst of all was the black lace veil that completely hid her face, tied so tightly it bit into her skin. She could hear the whispers slithering through the crowd. What's wrong with that one? Too plain even for the coal merchant. Her own stepmother brought her here like this. Viscountess Drusilla Hargrave stood a few feet away in rich burgundy silk, her powdered face serene, as though she were presenting a fine horse rather than the girl she had raised. Elowen kept her gaze fixed on the floor, wrists bound loosely in front of her. She had long stopped hoping for kindness. All she felt now was a quiet, bone-deep resignation. Whatever came next, she would endure it. She always had. A sudden hush fell over the hall. The great doors swung open with a groan. In strode Duke Valerian Crowe of Blackmere. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a black velvet tailcoat trimmed in deep crimson, the fabric catching the candlelight like dried blood. Gold embroidery glinted at his cuffs, and black leather gloves encased his powerful hands. His dark hair was swept back, accentuating sharp features, a commanding mustache, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to cut through every soul in the room. The most feared and powerful man in the county had arrived. Mothers straightened. Daughters lifted their chins. Whispers turned to hopeful murmurs. Every eligible woman in the hall silently prayed he might look their way. Duke Valerian did not. He moved down the line with slow, deliberate steps, his gaze sweeping over the pretty faces and fine gowns like a man inspecting goods he had already decided were beneath him. He passed a lovely girl in pale blue. He ignored a widow with a substantial dowry. Each step brought him closer to the end of the row, to Elowen. He stopped directly in front of her. The silence became absolute. Even the auction master seemed to hold his breath. Valerian's cold blue eyes traveled over her torn gown, the slave collar, the dangling leash, and the heavy black veil that hid her completely. A faint, cruel smile touched his lips. "This one," he said, his deep voice carrying through the entire hall. "I will take her." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Viscountess Hargrave's eyes widened with greedy triumph. Several women stared in open disbelief. The Duke, the man who could have chosen any beauty in England, had selected the most degraded, veiled, and worthless creature on display. Elowen's heart hammered painfully against her ribs. She felt the weight of every stare, the sting of fresh humiliation burning beneath the veil. This man had not chosen her by accident. She could feel it in the way his gaze lingered, in the satisfied tone of his voice. He had chosen her on purpose, to break her. The auction master stammered out the terms, but Duke Valerian waved a gloved hand impatiently. Gold changed hands. The leash was placed into his grip. "Come," he commanded, giving the leather a sharp tug. Elowen stumbled forward, the collar biting into her neck. As he led her through the parting crowd, she could feel the eyes of the entire hall burning into her back. She did not know what awaited her at Blackmere Manor, but one thing was painfully clear. Her new master had no intention of showing mercy, and the worst was yet to come. The private parlor was small and dimly lit, its heavy velvet curtains drawn against the night. A single solicitor sat at a polished oak table, papers spread before him like a death sentence. Elowen stood motionless in the center of the room, still veiled, still collared, the leash now resting in Duke Valerian Crowe's gloved hand. The heavy door had closed behind them with a finality that echoed in her bones. Valerian did not offer her a seat. He remained standing, tall and imposing in his black and crimson coat, studying her like one might examine a flawed piece of livestock. "Remove the hood only when I command it," he said, his voice low and precise, each word carved from ice. "You will speak only when spoken to. You will not look me in the eyes unless I permit it. This is not a marriage in any true sense. It is a contract. I require a Duchess in name only to manage Blackmere Manor when necessary and, in time, to provide an heir. Nothing more." He began pacing slowly, the leash sliding through his fingers with a soft, threatening whisper. "I have no interest in your conversation, your feelings, or your company. You will keep to your assigned rooms. You will not interfere in my affairs. You will be invisible, silent, obedient. If you please me in these things, you will be fed, clothed, and left alone. If you do not," he let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate, "there are many ways a man in my position can make a woman regret her existence." Elowen's hands trembled slightly within their bindings, but she kept her posture straight. Beneath the veil, her breathing remained steady. She had endured worse, far worse. Drusilla Hargrave's years of calculated cruelty had taught her one valuable lesson: silence was armor. Valerian stopped directly before her. She could feel the heat of his presence, smell the faint scent of sandalwood and leather. "Do you understand the terms?" he asked coldly. Elowen nodded once. "Speak." "Yes, Your Grace," she replied softly, her voice calm and clear despite the tightness in her throat. "I understand." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly hidden. He had expected tears, perhaps begging. Instead, this veiled creature stood before him with a quiet dignity that unsettled him more than any outburst could have. The solicitor cleared his throat and began reading the documents. Settlement for Viscountess Hargrave. A modest allowance for the new Duchess. Separate chambers. No expectations of affection or fidelity. The words flowed like cold water over stone. When it was time to sign, Valerian took the quill and scratched his name with sharp, impatient strokes. Then he placed the pen in Elowen's bound hands. She signed without hesitation, Elowen Voss, her handwriting small but steady. The moment the documents were sealed, Viscountess Hargrave was ushered in just long enough to collect her payment. She did not look at Elowen. She simply took the envelope, offered the Duke a simpering smile, and left without a single word of farewell to the girl she had raised. The door clicked shut once more. Valerian stared at Elowen for a long moment, the leash still wrapped around his fist. He stepped closer until she could feel the brush of his crimson lapel against her veil. "You belong to me now," he murmured, his voice dark with satisfaction, "and I intend to make full use of that fact." He gave the leash a deliberate tug, pulling her toward the door. "Come. The carriage is waiting." As they stepped out into the cold night air, Elowen felt the weight of her new reality settle over her like chains. Blackmere Manor awaited, an ancient brooding estate said to swallow its mistresses whole, and the man leading her into the darkness had made his intentions brutally clear. She was not his wife. She was his punishment, yet somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and humiliation, a quiet spark of defiance refused to die. What would happen when this ruthless duke discovered that the plain, broken girl he had purchased was far stronger than he imagined? The carriage ride to Blackmere Manor was long and silent. Elowen sat in the shadows, the leather collar chafing against her throat with every jolt of the wheels. Duke Valerian sat opposite her, his long legs stretched out, one gloved hand still loosely holding the end of her leash. He did not speak. He did not even look at her. His piercing blue eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the window, as though she were already invisible, just as he had demanded. When the carriage finally slowed, Elowen caught her first glimpse of her new home through a gap in the curtains. Blackmere Manor rose like a beast from the mist, massive stone towers, darkened windows, and ivy crawling over its walls like desperate fingers. Even in the moonlight, it looked cold and unwelcoming, a place that had forgotten warmth long ago. The carriage door opened. Valerian stepped out first, then gave the leash a firm tug. Out. Elowen descended carefully, her torn crimson gown whispering against the gravel. The heavy collar and veil made every movement awkward and humiliating. Servants had assembled in 2 neat lines along the entrance hall, their lanterns casting long, flickering shadows, nearly 40 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Duke Valerian did not bother with introductions. "This is Her Grace, the new Duchess of Blackmere," he announced flatly. "She is to be given every courtesy. See that she is settled." Without another word, he released the leash, turned on his heel, and strode toward his study, his crimson-trimmed coat disappearing into the darkness of the corridor. The heavy door slammed behind him, leaving Elowen standing alone before the silent staff. A middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair stepped forward first, the housekeeper. Her expression was carefully neutral, though her eyes flicked over the veil and collar with poorly concealed surprise. "I am Mrs. Hargrove, Your Grace. Welcome to Blackmere." Beside her, a young maid with a round, kind face and wide, curious eyes offered a tentative curtsy. "Posy Wren, Ma'am. I've been assigned as your personal maid." Posy's voice was soft and warm, the first gentle sound Elowen had heard in hours. But even she couldn't quite hide her shock at the sight of the new Duchess, still veiled and collared like a prisoner. From the back of the line, a tall, angular man with sharp features watched Elowen with open disdain. Mr. Graves, the estate steward. His thin lips curled slightly as his gaze traveled over her ragged appearance. "If you'll follow me, Your Grace," Mrs. Hargrove said, leading her up the wide staircase. The leash still dangled from Elowen's collar, swaying with each step like a mark of ownership. Her new chambers were large but lifeless, cold marble floors, heavy drapes, and furniture draped in white sheets that had clearly not been removed in years. A fire had been hastily lit, but it did little to chase away the chill. Posy moved quickly to help her, but Elowen raised a bound hand gently. "Thank you, Posy. I can manage for now." The young maid hesitated, clearly wanting to say more, but Mrs. Hargrove gave her a warning look. Mr. Graves lingered in the doorway a moment longer, his eyes narrowing. "The Duke has particular ways," he said coldly. "Best not to test them." With that the staff withdrew, leaving Elowen alone in the oppressive silence of her new prison. She touched the edge of her veil, feeling the lace tremble beneath her fingers. The Duke had not yet ordered it removed. She remained hidden, invisible, exactly as he wished. But as she stood in the center of the grand, joyless room, listening to the distant echo of footsteps fading through the manor, a quiet resolve settled deep within her chest. She had survived Viscountess Hargrave's cruelty. She would survive this. Still, As the candles flickered lower and the weight of the collar pressed against her throat, one question haunted her. How long would the ruthless Duke keep her hidden? And what would happen the moment he finally demanded she reveal herself? The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long shadows across the cold chamber. Elowen sat motionless on the edge of the velvet chaise, still fully dressed in her torn crimson gown, the leather collar heavy around her neck. Hours had passed since her arrival, yet the Duke had not summoned her. The silence of Blackmere Manor pressed in like a living thing. A sharp knock sounded on the door. Before she could answer, it swung open. Duke Valerian Crowe filled the doorway, still wearing his black and crimson tailcoat, the gold embroidery catching the dying firelight. His piercing blue eyes swept over her, lingering on the dangling leash that still hung from her collar. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him with deliberate quiet. "Stand," he commanded. Elowen rose slowly, her heart pounding. The air between them felt charged, thick with unspoken expectation. Valerian approached until he towered over her. For a long moment he simply stared at the black lace veil that had hidden her face since the auction. Then, without warning, his gloved hand shot forward. He seized the edge of the veil and ripped it away in one brutal motion. The lace tore free. Elowen's auburn hair tumbled slightly loose from its pins, catching the firelight in warm golden red waves. Her face, delicate, striking, with high cheekbones, full lips, and large, expressive doe-like eyes, stood fully revealed for the first time. Valerian froze. His hand still clutched the torn veil. The arrogant satisfaction on his face shattered. His blue eyes widened, pupils flaring with raw shock. The breath he had been about to take caught in his throat. For several agonizing seconds, the ruthless Duke of Blackmere stood completely motionless, staring at the woman he had purchased to humiliate. She was not plain. She was breathtaking. Something dark and dangerous flickered across his expression. Disbelief, followed swiftly by suspicion. His jaw tightened, the muscles flexing beneath his mustache. He stepped closer, gloved fingers catching her chin, tilting her face roughly toward the light as if searching for some trick, some deception hidden in her features. "Who are you?" I demanded, voice low and rough. "What game is this?" Elowen met his gaze steadily, though her pulse thundered in her ears. "There is no game, Your Grace," she whispered. "I am exactly who my stepmother presented me as, only she took great care to hide what she did not wish to sell." Valerian's eyes narrowed. He released her chin as though her skin had burned him. The torn veil slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor. For the first time since the auction, he seemed truly unsettled, his carefully constructed indifference cracking before her eyes. He took one step back, then another. "You were meant to be nothing," he said, almost to himself. "A shadow. A punishment." Yet the woman standing before him in her ragged crimson gown, collar still locked around her throat, was anything but nothing. A storm of conflicting emotions crossed his face. Anger, unwanted fascination, and something sharper, almost like betrayal. Without another word, he turned sharply on his heel and strode toward the door. "Stay out of my sight," he growled over his shoulder. The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the candles. Elowen remained standing in the center of the room, breathing hard, the torn veil lying at her feet like a discarded lie. She touched her bare face with trembling fingers, feeling strangely exposed. The Duke had seen her, and the man who had bought her to break her now looked as though he had been the one shattered. What would he do with this dangerous truth? Days blurred into weeks at Blackmere Manor, each one heavier than the last. Duke Valerian Crowe kept his distance exactly as promised. He took meals in his study, rode out before dawn, and returned long after nightfall. Elowen saw him only in passing, a tall, dark figure in the corridors or watching silently from the upper gallery. He never spoke to her, he never summoned her. She remained a ghost in her own home. But Elowen refused to remain invisible. She began with small things. The east wing, long closed and shrouded in dust sheets, caught her attention first. With Posy Wren's hesitant help, she had the rooms aired and the furniture uncovered. Then came the household accounts. Mr. Graves, the steward, resisted at first, dismissing her requests with cold politeness. But Elowen persisted, quiet, patient, and unrelenting. She spent hours in the dim light of the estate office, comparing ledgers, noting waste and unnecessary expenses. By the end of the second week, the kitchens were running more efficiently. The linen stores had been reorganized. The overgrown rose garden, neglected for years, now showed the first signs of care as she worked alongside the elderly gardener, directing which bushes to prune and which beds to clear. Posy watched her with growing admiration. "You're not what they expected, Your Grace," the young maid whispered one afternoon as they sorted through old silver. "None of them know what to make of you." Elowen offered a small, tired smile. "Good. Let them wonder." She still wore the collar. The Duke had never ordered it removed. The leather had begun to feel like a second skin, a constant reminder of her place in his world. Yet every quiet victory in the manor chipped away at the shame. From the shadows, Duke Valerian watched. He told himself it was mere curiosity. He would stand at the library window overlooking the gardens, arms crossed, blue eyes narrowed as he observed Elowen directing 2 footmen to move a fallen statue. Or he would pause in the corridor when he heard her soft voice giving calm instructions to the housekeeper. Each time the same unsettling feeling stirred in his chest. She was not broken. She was not cowering. Instead of shrinking under his indifference, she was quietly reshaping his neglected domain. And she did it without once seeking his approval. One evening, as golden dusk settled over the grounds, Valerian stood on the balcony above the south terrace. Below, Elowen knelt in the dirt beside a rose bed, sleeves rolled up, auburn hair catching the fading light. She carefully staked a struggling bush, her movements gentle yet sure. For a long moment he simply stared, unable to look away. The woman he had bought to humiliate was blooming right before his eyes. A sharp twist of something, anger, fascination, perhaps even hunger, tightened in his gut. He gripped the stone railing until his knuckles whitened. This was not how it was supposed to go. That night, unable to sleep, Valerian found himself walking the dimly lit halls. He stopped outside the library doors. Soft firelight spilled beneath them. He pushed the door open silently. Elowen sat. Elowen sat curled in the deep wingback chair by the library fire, a heavy ledger open on her lap. The flames danced softly, casting warm light across the rows of ancient books that lined the walls. Sleep had become a stranger these past nights, so she had taken to wandering the manor after midnight, finding solace among the dusty volumes. The door creaked open. She looked up, startled. Duke Valerian stood in the doorway, still dressed in his evening coat, his dark hair slightly disheveled as though he too had been pacing the halls. His piercing blue eyes locked onto her. For a moment neither of them spoke. "You should be in bed," he said gruffly, stepping inside. Elowen closed the ledger slowly. "As should you, Your Grace." He didn't leave. Instead, he crossed to the opposite chair and sat, stretching his long legs toward the fire. The silence stretched between them, thick and uneasy. It was the closest they had been since the night he tore away her veil. Elowen rose quietly and moved toward the lower shelves where she had been organizing old estate records earlier that day. As she reached for a misplaced ledger, a small bundle of yellowed letters tied with a faded ribbon slipped from between 2 heavy volumes and fell to the floor. She knelt to retrieve them. The handwriting on the top envelope caught her eye. It was addressed to her mother. Her breath caught. With trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon and opened the first letter, then the next, and the next. The words blurred as she read, but the truth burned itself into her heart with every line. Her parents had been legally married years before her stepmother's union. She was not illegitimate. She was the rightful heir to a significant fortune and title that had been deliberately stolen and buried. and the man responsible for forging documents and erasing the first marriage. Lord Peregrine Voss, her own blood relative. The same man who had once been connected to the previous Duchess of Blackmere. Elowen's hands shook as she clutched the letters. Everything she had endured, the humiliation at the debt auction, the cruel bargain, the collar still locked around her throat, had been built on a foundation of lies and greed. A floorboard creaked. She looked up to find Duke Valerian standing over her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "What have you found?" he asked, voice low. Elowen hesitated only a moment before handing him the letters. "The truth," she whispered, "about who I really am and who destroyed my family." Valerian took the papers. As he read, his face darkened. Recognition, rage. A muscle jumped in his jaw. When he reached the final letter bearing Lord Peregrine Voss's unmistakable handwriting, something dangerous flickered in his blue eyes. "He was involved in my first wife's death as well," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I always suspected it, but I could never prove." He looked down at Elowen, still kneeling on the cold floor in her simple nightdress, the leather collar stark against her pale throat. For the first time, his gaze held something other than suspicion or cold calculation. It held recognition and fury on her behalf. "These letters change everything," he murmured, his voice rough. "If this reaches the wrong ears before we are ready—" He did not finish the sentence, but the threat hung heavy in the air between them. Elowen rose slowly to face him. In the firelight, with her auburn hair loose and her eyes bright with quiet fire, she looked nothing like the broken girl he had purchased at auction. Lord Peregrine Voss had no idea what he had awakened, and neither, it seemed, did the Duke, who now stood staring at her as though seeing her clearly for the very first time. 2 weeks after the discovery of the letters, the past arrived at Blackmere uninvited. Elowen was in the drawing-room reviewing household ledgers when Mrs. Hargrove appeared, her face unusually pale. "Lord Peregrine Voss has come calling, Your Grace. He insists on speaking with you. The Duke is out riding and not expected back for some time." Elowen's stomach tightened. She knew the name too well now. The man who had buried her parents' marriage. The man who had stolen her birthright. She rose, smoothing her simple day gown, the leather collar still a constant weight around her throat. "Show him in." Lord Peregrine Voss entered with the smooth confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime bending the world to his will. Tall, silver-haired, elegantly dressed in charcoal and deep green, he carried an air of benevolent charm that barely concealed the predator beneath. "My dear Duchess," he said warmly, taking her hand and brushing a kiss across her knuckles. His eyes, however, were cold as they flicked over her collar. "How unexpected to find you here, and wearing such charming accessories. Tell me, does the Duke still keep you on a short leash?" Elowen withdrew her hand calmly. "What do you want, Lord Voss?" His smile never faltered. He circled her slowly, like a wolf assessing prey. "I want you to understand your place," he said softly. "Those letters you found are dangerous fantasies. Should you pursue them, I will ensure everyone learns the truth about your origins. The bastard daughter of a scandalous union, sold at a debt auction like common goods. A woman who trapped a duke through deception. Society will devour you. And your husband, well, he has already lost one wife under mysterious circumstances. It would be tragic if history repeated itself." Elowen's blood ran cold, but she kept her voice steady. "Are you threatening me?" "Merely advising you, my dear. Burn the letters. Stay silent. Enjoy your new title while it lasts." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Or I will destroy everything you have so carefully begun to build here." He left as smoothly as he had arrived, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Elowen waited until his carriage disappeared down the drive before she fled to the garden. The late afternoon sun filtered through the newly pruned rose bushes, but she barely saw them. She sank onto a stone bench, arms wrapped tightly around herself, the collar suddenly feeling like a noose. The threats echoed in her mind. She had survived cruelty before, but this was different. This man held real power, power that could ruin not only her, but the fragile life she was building at Blackmere. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path. She looked up to find Duke Valerian standing a few feet away, still in his riding coat, his face shadowed with concern. His blue eyes took in her trembling hands, her pale cheeks, the way she fought to hold herself together. "What happened?" he demanded, voice low. When she told him every chilling word, something in Valerian shifted. The cold mask he usually wore cracked. His jaw tightened, and a dangerous glint entered his eyes. He stepped forward and, for the first time, reached out without command or cruelty. His gloved hand gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You are not alone in this," he said, his voice rough with quiet fury. "Peregrine Voss will not touch you. Not while you are under my protection." Elowen searched his face, stunned by the intensity she found there. This was no longer the indifferent man who had bought her to break her. This was something far more dangerous, a man beginning to care. Valerian's thumb brushed lightly across her cheek, a touch so unexpectedly tender it stole her breath. "Come inside," he murmured. "We have plans to make." As they walked back toward the manor together, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back, Elowen felt the first real crack in the walls between them. But Lord Peregrine Voss was not a man who surrendered easily. And the storm he would bring next threatened to destroy everything. The Aldermore Ball was the event of the season, a glittering gathering of England's elite beneath crystal chandeliers and swirling candlelight. For the first time in years, Duke Valerian Crowe did not arrive alone. Elowen walked beside him on his arm, dressed in a deep sapphire gown that the posy had secretly altered from the manor's forgotten stores. The leather collar was gone, replaced by a delicate diamond necklace that shimmered against her throat. Her auburn hair was swept into an elegant style that caught the light with every step. She looked every inch the Duchess she had become. Heads turned, conversations faltered. The ruthless Duke of Blackmere had brought his mysterious veiled bride into society at last, and she was stunning. Valerian's hand rested possessively at the small of her back as they descended the grand staircase. His black and crimson coat made him look more dangerous than ever, but tonight his blue eyes held something new when they looked at her: pride. Lord Peregrine Voss did not waste time. He approached them midway through the evening, all charm and poisoned smiles, two influential gentlemen at his side. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, bowing to Valerian before turning to Elowen. "And the new Duchess, how remarkable to see you unveiled at last. One does wonder about the circumstances of such a sudden union. A debt auction, was it not? And with such questionable origins." A hush spread through the nearby guests. Fans paused mid-flutter. Elowen felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but she lifted her chin. Before she could speak, Valerian stepped forward, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I am glad you raised the matter, Lord Voss," he said, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear. "It saves me the trouble," he gestured sharply. A magistrate and two clerks stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, carrying leather portfolios. Valerian's gaze never left Peregrine's face. "These documents prove that Elowen Voss is the legitimate daughter of a lawful marriage, a marriage you helped erase through forgery and deceit. They also connect you to the suspicious circumstances surrounding my first wife's death and the theft of significant estates." Gasps rippled across the ballroom. Peregrine's charming mask slipped, revealing the venom beneath. "You dare accuse me," he began. "I do more than accuse," Valerian interrupted, his voice cold and commanding. "I have proof, witnesses, and the full weight of the crown behind me." He turned to Elowen then, right there in front of the entire assembly. His gloved hand took hers, lifting it to his lips in a public declaration that silenced every whisper. "This woman," he said, his voice ringing with quiet intensity, was sold like chattel by those who should have protected her. She was brought to me in rags and chains so that I might break her. Instead, she has restored my home, exposed old evils, and shown me what true strength looks like. She is my Duchess, my wife, and anyone who dares threaten her will answer to me." Elowen's heart thundered as she looked up at him. In his piercing blue eyes she saw not just protection, but something deeper, something raw and real that had been growing between them in the quiet shadows of Blackmere. Lord Peregrine Voss was escorted from the ballroom by the magistrate amid stunned silence. The music slowly resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. The Duke and his Duchess were no longer a scandal. They were a force. Later, as they stood on a quiet terrace overlooking the moonlit gardens, Valerian turned to her. The ruthless mask had fallen away completely. "I should have removed that collar the night I first saw your face," he said, voice rough with regret. "I was a fool." Elowen smiled softly, her fingers tightening around his. "You are not a fool now." But even as warmth bloomed between them, she knew the battle was not yet over. Legal proceedings still loomed. Lord Peregrine Voss was wounded, not defeated. And the final reckoning was still to come. 3 months later, the final gavel fell in the county court. Lord Peregrine Voss was stripped of his ill-gotten titles and lands. The truth of Elowen's parentage was restored, and the fortune that had been stolen from her returned in full. The man who had once threatened to destroy her now faced ruin of his own making. Elowen stood on the south terrace of Blackmere Manor as the news reached them, the spring sun warm on her face. The leather collar had long since been removed and burned. In its place rested a simple gold chain with a single sapphire pendant, a gift from Valerian the day the first verdict came through. The gardens she had quietly tended for months now burst with life. Roses climbed newly repaired trellises in rich crimson and soft pink. Neat gravel paths wound between blooming beds, and the fountain that had stood dry for years now sparkled in the sunlight. Blackmere itself seemed to breathe again. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Valerian came to stand beside her, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the flowers. He no longer wore the cold, distant mask he had perfected over years. The ruthless Duke looked at her now with open, unguarded eyes. "You did this," he said quietly, gesturing to the garden. "You brought it back to life." "We did," she corrected, softly. Together he turned to face her fully. The man who had once ripped off her veil with cruel indifference now looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in his world. He reached out and took both her hands in his. "I have spent my life building walls," he confessed, his deep voice rough with emotion. "After my first wife, after the betrayal and loss, I told myself I would never be vulnerable again. Then I saw you at that auction, veiled, collared, broken in appearance, and I thought I had found the perfect weapon against my own heart, a wife I could own without ever truly seeing." Valerian stepped closer, his thumbs brushing over her knuckles. "But you refused to be broken. You refused to disappear. Every quiet act of defiance, every rose you saved, every ledger you corrected. You dismantled every defense I had. And when I finally saw your face that night, I knew I was lost." Elowen's heart swelled as she looked up into those piercing blue eyes. "I was terrified of you," she admitted. "But I was more terrified of disappearing completely. So I chose to endure, to build. And somewhere along the way, I found myself falling for the man behind the cruelty." Valerian cupped her face with both hands, his touch reverent. "I love you, Elowen," he said, the words simple and fierce, not as a contract, not as a possession, but as my equal, my partner, my Duchess in every way that matters. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was slow, deep, and filled with months of unspoken longing, all the fear, the tension, the quiet yearning finally given voice. When they parted, Valerian rested his forehead against hers. "The garden is not the only thing you have brought back to life," he murmured. "You have brought me back." They stood together in the golden evening light, surrounded by the beauty she had coaxed from neglect. The past, the debt auction, the humiliation, the threats, felt distant now, like a dark chapter finally closed. Yet as Valerian pulled her closer, his arms strong and sure around her, Elowen smiled against his chest. Their story had begun in the cruelest of ways, but it would continue in love, in strength, and in the quiet promise of many more gardens yet to bloom. If this story has you hooked, if you can feel that slow, gripping tension, go ahead and like, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys unforgettable storytelling. New stories drop every day, each one more intense than the last. And before you leave, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing who's part of this journey. We may be wrapping up here, but the drama doesn't end. If your pulse is still racing, keep it going. The next 2 stories on your screen go even deeper, darker, bolder, impossible to ignore. Subscribe so we stay connected. Then pick one and dive in. Your next obsession is just one click away.